any technology that's introduced into an unjust society is likely to exacerbate existing inequalities.
Are you wondering how you can learn more about food? Well, you're in the right place. This is the Chakula podcast, brought to you by the Root to Food Initiative, a show that celebrates authentic Kenyan dishes and serves you hot conversations about food in Kenya from an economic, social, and political lens. Sema nasi kwenye social media at Root to Food on Instagram, at Root to Food on Twitter, and Root to Food on Facebook. And now, here's your host, Felistas Mwalia.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Chakula podcast. Today we are having a very interesting conversation, which most likely has been on top of your head. It's about the use of data in agriculture and the impact of data on our food systems. I'll be joined by Zahra Moloo, who does media and research work for ETC Group. She'll give us a brief description on what ETC does. She's also an investigative journalist and a freelance documentary filmmaker. Karibu sana, Zahra.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
As part of her work at ETC Group, she took part in directing a very interesting film on the impacts of digital takeover on our food and farming systems.
A silent earthquake is fracturing our food systems. These new cracks are spreading all the way from digital giants in Silicon Valley and Seattle and shadowy asset management companies on Wall Street, through the industrial food chain, heading for seeds, shop shelves, and the food on your table. Whether we grow, sell, or buy food, we're all going to be impacted by these rapidly spreading fault lines. But they are not only interested in food, they are interested in data as well. Big finance is investing in the technology sector too, and together they have plans about how to use that data to make money.
Zahra, maybe to start us off, you can tell us the role and importance of data in sustainable food systems.
Sure. Well, that's an interesting question because if you think about data, when we ask the question that way, what's the role of data in sustainable food systems? It's sort of like asking, it's an example of a technology looking for a purpose,
Yeah.
So maybe it's more important to look at the food system first and question whether data actually adds something to it. So if we define data can mean a few things. One way of defining data is, facts and figures that you use to support decision making, that you can analyze to support decision making. So we can ask, well, is it useful for farmers and peasants to have access to facts and figures to help them make decisions? Yes. But the key thing here is to actually have people who produce food, peasants and farmers, as sovereign in those decision-making processes. And then perhaps if they have access to tools that they can use and share, then maybe it can be useful. And, there was a panel of migrant food workers that said that they found it very useful to have things like Signal, WhatsApp, other means of organizing their work, but those are more communication tools rather than data. And so another way of defining data is, I guess, the way we would usually define it today, which is a computer-readable form of knowledge that can be processed or stored on a computer. And then the question is, well, is it useful for computer processed knowledge to be used in sustainable food systems? And there, the assumption is that there'll be that in future we'll have more machines. Machines will take the place of people, either in their work or, through AI, automation. And then you have a whole different set of looking at it, a whole different way of looking at it. And then you're asking, can sustainable agriculture be delivered by machines rather than people? And that's very different from the concept of food sovereignty, which is really about food systems that are for people. So perhaps there are ways to use data to support food sovereignty. So for example, during COVID, a lot of farmers were trying to sell their produce directly to consumers. And perhaps there are ways to have databases or platforms that can do that. But the problem is that can become a double-edged sword because that can also cut out other parts of food economies and bring in these kind of fintech platforms like e-payments. And then big financial players might end up coming into the equation. So I'll give an example. There was an example of Twiga Foods.
Yeah.
Twiga Foods is an agri-tech start company that was founded by a US academic and who wanted to connect farmers to small vendors and bypass the powerful cartels. So Twiga Foods built up a whole fleet of trucks to source food from farmers outside Nairobi and deliver that directly to a network of vendors in the city. And so, and all of these transactions were organized through cell phones, run on Microsoft's digital platform, and they have a cloud service called Azure. And then Twiga ended up catching the attention of big companies like Goldman Sachs, a French family that owns this big supermarket chain called Auchan. Then they partnered with IBM. And so what ended up happening is that Twiga now sells food directly to consumers, and the small vendors have been cut out. Basically, they were trying to help small vendors to sell directly to consumers. Now Twiga itself is selling food to consumers. And so all those small vendors that they were supposed to be serving have been cut out of this model. And so, you started off with a model that seemed very good in theory to have producers sell to consumers. But when you start having these very big players coming into the system, it ends up actually having a very negative impact in the long term. And you have corporations inserting themselves into this system, and it doesn't end up being sustainable for food producers. So, when you ask the question of whether data can be, what's its role in sustainable food systems, I think we have to ask the question in a very critical way. Understand, what does data mean? What is a sustainable food system? And who is that sustainable for? Is it sustainable for producers, for consumers? Or are you having big data giants coming in and actually taking advantage of this system?
I really like how you've been able to summarize the role and the importance of data. And you've mentioned something interesting about we're supposed to ask ourselves critical questions on what does sustainable mean to us. Zahra, probably as a researcher on sustainable food systems, probably you could define this to the listeners. What does sustainable mean to you?
That's actually a very good question. I think a sustainable food system has to be sustainable in several ways. It has to be sustainable to the people who are producing food. First of all, they have to be at the center of the system, because they are the ones who are feeding us. They are the ones who have to live from a food system that's sustainable. But it also has to be sustainable to the environment. And we do know how much, the industrial food system has been absolutely catastrophic for the environment. It has, really contributed to climate change. And yet that is the model that is being pushed by big agribusiness companies. So a sustainable food system, I think, as we say at etc. Group, where I work, we often think of a sustainable food system as connected to the peasant food web. It's a food web. It's a complex, biologically diverse, ecologically sustainable system in which you're not using all these sort of engineered seeds, pesticides. You are relying on indigenous knowledge and farmers' knowledge to have this kind of food system. And it's important to remember that actually, according to the Food and Agriculture Organization, 70% of the world's food supply comes from peasant and family food system. 70%. And you wouldn't think that if you read online in the media about all these, Syngenta and Bayer and all these companies that are supposedly providing tools to farmers. But actually, most of our food comes from peasant and family food systems. And those are far more sustainable food systems than the industrial model of agriculture that's being sort of pushed on the world, and including in the global south. And so agroecology is something that a lot of people who are fighting for food sovereignty show as this can be a sustainable food system for the planet and for families and for peasants and for farmers and for consumers. You have good food that's not contaminated with pesticides and all that stuff.
There has been a lot of conversation around on how organizations and how different governments react to sustainable practices, emphasizing that they will adapt climate smart agriculture. But is that really a solution?
I'm not sure I can speak so much to climate smart agriculture, to be honest. There's a lot to say about that. Yeah, climate smart agriculture. Again, there are a lot of these things that sound there's a lot of language that's used to sell to basically sell a certain way of doing things. And climate smart agriculture is one of them. Just like nature-based solutions, this kind of language that sounds very good for biodiversity and for people. But actually, you have to look at what climate smart agriculture is, who is pushing it, who's behind it. It's actually not that climate smart after all.
Probably you can also mention how data on food systems is collected.
I guess to understand how data is being collected with regard to food systems, it's to understand the larger trend that's happening in the world of food and agriculture. And so what we've been seeing at etc. Group is that, all the sort of big agribusiness companies that grew very rich and powerful from the food system, from the industrial food system, are now partnering up with big data giants. So you have these big data giants, these big companies partnering pairing up with big agribusiness companies. So you have in the agriculture world or the agribusiness world, you have just a few corporations that control, the seed market, the agrochemical market, and those companies, as you will see in the animation, are Bayer, which bought up Monsanto. You have Corteva Agriscience, Syngenta, BASF. Those are the four big companies, and there are of course a few others, large corporations that have really benefited from the industrial food system that are teaming up with data giants, and they've realized that data is a very valuable resource, and the more of it that is hoarded and aggregated, the more it increases in value. And so what's happening with data, how it's being collected, is being collected in ways that are very misleading to farmers and that are not really transparent. So if you look at a lot of the narratives around digital farming, you see that it's being presented as if it's going to be very transformative and very useful for farmers, that if they have digital tools, farmers can have greater efficiency on their farms, they'll have greater return on their investments. And so they think they're receiving a service from these companies, that their agriculture is going to become better due to all these services they're being given. But actually what's happening is that's how data is then being collected from them. As they subscribe to platforms and use these so-called services being offered by these companies, their data is actually being taken for free and passed onwards and used for other things. So for example, I'll give an example of how it works. Like there's this digital platform called Climate Field View, and this was developed by the Climate Corporation, and the Climate Corporation was bought by Monsanto in 2013 for $1 billion. And a lot of people were wondering, well, why is Monsanto buying up this platform that's all about climate and weather information? But the key is that the data was going to be very useful. And so now Climate Field View, this platform, claims to be on 60 million hectares of land in 23 countries. And they offer services like providing information about the state of your soil if you're a farmer. They have this feature called field capture. So you take pictures in your field of diseases that might be on your crops. And then that information goes into the cloud and it's searched against thousands of photos from Bayer. And then they suggest to you which products and herbicides from Bayer you can use. And this is just one example of a platform. There's many others, owned by the other data giants. And so what they're doing is they're extracting data on your seeds, your soil, your fertilizers, the weather, and all of this is being then passed on to their artificial intelligence systems. And then in response, they can suggest what farmers should produce, what products they should use, when they should farm. So these are sort of the ways in which data is being collected from farmers. There's also data being collected, from consumers. So when you go shopping and you're using a lot of these apps, your shopping preferences, the things you're buying are also being collected from you. And that information is very valuable, because then you're basically, giving information that they can use to expand the market in their services. And so that's sort of an example of how data is collected.
Yeah, it seems that data really plays a critical role in our food systems. And probably you can also mention to us the gaps in regulating data on food systems and its utilization.
Yeah, the gaps are it's difficult, because what's happening is that this model is becoming very, very legitimate and widespread. So regulation hasn't really been sufficient in response to what's happening. And you're seeing that actually these big companies, Amazon, Apple, Microsoft, Alphabet, they've become so powerful that even governments and organizations like the UN are listening to their advice on public health, on education, on digital cooperation. And it's becoming so much part of how things work that we're starting to assume that digital technologies are going to solve all the problems in the world. So in terms of regulation, I don't think it's quite happening as fast at the progress or the development in this sort of data world and systems that have been captured by the use of data is happening so fast that the regulation doesn't seem to be keeping up. If you look, we have coming up in September, there's the UN Food System Summit coming up this month. And that's a whole other thing that's quite controversial. But the Africa position at the UN Food System Summit is that Africa needs to adopt more digitalization in the food sector. And that position just shows, how much, this partnership between big food companies and digital companies has progressed. That it's to that point where, African governments are also saying that we need to adopt digitalization.
They clearly have a big role in policies, in influencing policies, from what you've mentioned.
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Zahra, you can also mention to us how the data is used. You've mentioned a few. Go ahead and mention more of the positives and the negatives, if there are any potential positives on how data is used.
So how data is used, we don't know 100%, but there are different things that have been happening. So one example is, I'll tell you about another digital platform, which is As Your Farm Beats. So last year, Microsoft and the Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa, which is funded mainly by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. It's an institution that has really been kind of pushing this market-based approach to agriculture. So Microsoft and AGRA, they started to expand this digital platform called As Your Farm Beats with an app called Kuzabot. And this is a kind of chatbot app that farmers can use to get advice through WhatsApp and SMS, including, which inputs to use, which companies to buy from. And Farm Beats has integrated a US-based startup called Climate Edge into its platform. And Climate Edge is actually taking data about small farmers that's being supplied by agricultural consultants, by NGOs, by companies and researchers. And then they're selling that information to insurance companies, to pesticide dealers, to large food companies like Unilever. So this information that's being taken for free is being sold to others that can then use it. So for example, pesticide dealers can find that they have a market for their products and they are receiving data about what farmers are using. And so that's one way in which data is being used. It's being sold, actually. And what this is also allowing is for agricultural companies to sell their products. So another, actually the leading provider of chatbot services to farmers in Kenya is Arifu. And they are partnered with the seeds and pesticides multinational Syngenta. So what Arifu is doing is creating a demand for seeds that come from Syngenta that can then be sold to farmers. So it's actually, the data is also providing a market for these companies to then sell their product. And Arifu is part of a bigger platform called Digifarm that's operated by Safaricom.
Yeah.
Digifarm provides millions of small farmers in Kenya with chatbot services. It sells them inputs and crop insurance. It gives them loans, sells their produce, and all of this is through M-Pesa. And of course, Safaricom charges a fee. So, these data platforms argue that they're providing financial services to rural people. But actually, this is a market. Farmers have to conform to the system. They have to buy the inputs that are promoted and sold on credit. They have to follow the advice of the chatbot in order to qualify for crop insurance, which they also pay for. They sell their crops to the company at a non-negotiable price. They receive payments on a digital money app, and there's a fee for that. So you can imagine what's actually not being said is that this is, as one organization, Grain, put it, they said, this is contract farming on a mass scale. I mentioned before, the other way data is being used is corporations are able to sort of nudge consumers to behave in certain ways, to buy certain products. So you'll have like consumer targeted discount coupons. You'll have products on sale. And those products have come from data that's been collected from consumers in order to then sell particular products like GMOs.
Yeah.
They analyze the consumer's shopping history to see, what kind of products they can buy. And so on. So that's ways in which data is being used. I can't actually think of a positive way in which data is being used. Well, because it's being controlled by these big digital companies, because it's and big agribusiness companies. So, it's really benefiting them. It's not there to benefit small farmers or our people who buy food. If a whole model would have, for it to be useful, for data collection to be useful, you'd have to have a whole different model with producers at the center.
I feel like I should change my question from the important role of building sustainable food systems, because from the conversation we've had right now, it seems that data doesn't seem to be building sustainable food systems.
No, exactly. I mean, what's made food systems vulnerable is not lack of access to data. Actually, it's climate change, it's seed appropriation, it's water and land grabbing. Lack of data is not preventing food systems from being sustainable.
So how can we enhance data while at the same time curbing the growing trend to use data in ways that disadvantage powerless actors for the advantage of the powerful?
Well, I think, one way is for farmers to take back control of their data, I think we need to really be talking about and exposing these deals and so-called free services that are extended by tech companies to extract information and data. That's one way, is to take back control over data. And, all this information on environmental data, genetic data, water data, soil data should remain in the public sphere and not be available for big tech companies to make use of it. And so there are some models that are quite interesting. So, for example, that offer free software in which data is not proprietary. There's a project called the Farm Hack Initiative, and that's a collaborative platform for sharing farm tools and knowledge among farmers across the world. So I think, we need to ask, what are the obstacles to sovereign data use, to having farmers and peasants able to exercise their own sovereignty and have control over their data? So we don't know, is it possible to produce data and use it without depending on agri-tech giants? That's a question that, we'd have to try different models. There have been other initiatives. For example, there's also the right to repair movement. Mm-hmm. And that is where, farmers have started advocating for their right to repair their own equipment. That has also been a problem, because you have big companies like John Deere, which provides farm machinery and tractors to farmers. They also extract data, and they don't allow you to repair your own equipment. When you enter into a contract with them, they still end up controlling the tractor that you've bought from them. So the right to repair movement is another example of redefining the role of data and asserting farmers' rights to their own equipment. There's also, of course, agroecology, which is a sustainable way forward in which you have ecologically just forms of food production that, again, have peasant farmers at the center. Mm-hmm. And then also, I think when we expose these kind of things, it's important to insist on consent. You need to have the free, prior, and informed consent of farmers and communities before you collect data from them. Other things that have been really useful are, mutual aid networks. So I mentioned during COVID how producers were connecting directly with consumers and not having to rely on middlemen to sort of extract profit in the middle. So there are those kind of things that have worked very well. For example, in India and Karnataka, there were farmers using Twitter to post videos of their produce, and buyers would connect with them that way. So there are things that can be done and that are being done by people. And then at Etc. Group, we really try to insist, and we actually have projects on assessing new technologies and evaluating them and seeing, who is behind these new digital technologies. Can it be useful for the common good? And so we try to have participatory technology assessment processes so that people can evaluate new technologies, examine who's behind them, how they're being used, are they actually being used for people and communities? And this kind of process has to involve civil society, indigenous people, farmers and peasants and those producing food. So there are different ways in which, things that we can do to analyze and maybe see if data can be used in a useful way. Yeah.
As we wind down, Zahra, do you have any punchy statements for the listeners and for me as well?
I can say, I guess when we think about technology, it's important to have a kind of, one of the things that we say at Etc. Group, that the founder of Etc. Group used to say a lot. He said that, any technology that's introduced into an unjust society is likely to exacerbate existing inequalities. So we need to think about that when it comes to any kind of technology, any kind of digital technology introduced into the food system or anything else. If you are introducing it into a society that's already very much unjust, then those injustices are likely to get worse. And as I said before, especially if you think about who's behind those technologies. And the other thing that I think is important is technology is political. It's not neutral. Mm-hmm. Technology is not good or bad or neutral. It's political. And it's important to understand technologies very well before evaluating whether, they're good or bad or whether they can be used.
Thank you so much for the insights, Zahra.
Thank you so much. It was great talking to you.
We've now come to the end of the show. Thank you so much to our listeners for listening in. Asanteni sana. See you next time.